In 2009, President Lula da Silva launched one of the most ambitious housing projects in Brazil's history, Minha Casa, Minha Vida, meaning my house, my life. According to the 2010 census, 6% of Brazil's total population lived in favelas. This new social development policy set about to increase access to adequate housing. With over 4 million houses built in the first decade of the program, it aimed to tackle the long-standing housing shortfalls that contributed to the spread of the country's vast informal settlements in and around cities. But Brazil has a serious problem with mafia-style groups, with a score of 8 out of 10 according to the Global Organized Crime Index, placing the country third in South America. One such group are the so-called militias, made up of former and serving members of military police or law enforcement. The militia groups have sought to profit from the housing market, and many residents now face the threat of violence, firearms, and even expulsion from their newly acquired homes. Militia involvement in the land and the real estate sector is widespread across Rio de Janeiro, as is their involvement in markets such as internet connectivity, water, security, and so on. Militias profit by extorting neighborhoods and controlling these industries, contributing to the high levels of extortion and protection racketeering that we see in the OC index, with Brazil scoring 7 out of 10. And these services are often provided in full view of state officials and enforcement agencies. Overall, criminality scores in Brazil are high, with a score of 6.77 out of 10. Globally, that places Brazil 22nd out of 193 countries. With me to take a closer look at the situation in Rio's urban areas is Antonio Sampaio, thematic lead for cities and illicit economies at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and Nicholas Pope, research fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Together, they have co-authored the report Coercive Brokers, Militias and Urban Governance in Rio de Janeiro. Nick, can I start with you first? How have militias come to control so much of, residential areas in Rio?
Thanks for the question, Finn. First of all, I think it's really important to put this into context. There's a really long historical process of violence in these marginalized regions of the city, especially in the west zone of Rio de Janeiro, where many of these militias operate. So we see echoes of this as far back as 100, 150 years ago in different parts of the city, where armed groups or violent groups are having quite opaque relationships with the state, and also having different types of relationships with populations. So I think it's important in this question to understand that militias, at least in Rio de Janeiro, derive much of their power through residential areas. So it's where the populations are. So where the population go, there are kind of opportunities for control, opportunities to make money, opportunities to create revenues, and therefore opportunities for social political capital as well. And this is what leads them to have different levels of control. And we're not just talking about any population here. We're talking about populations in a very geographically specific area of the city. So it's a frontier region that we've called it. So these areas are often new regions that are urbanizing in quite fast ways. And these figures, these violent figures, have always been part of slicing up and dicing up parts of the land, distributing the land, selling it off, buying and selling houses. So this, as I say, this region is quite new in urban terms. It used to be very agricultural, but as markets are expanding very quickly in this area, these actors have a specific role in facilitating these processes in these regions.
Thanks, Nick. Antonio, can I come to you next? So how involved are the militias in urban expansion in Rio? So, for example, are they involved, for example, in constructing new buildings?
Yeah, so over time with these deficiencies in urban planning and in infrastructure building, in Rio de Janeiro, at least the services provided by the state simply weren't there. The militias came to absorb a lot of these roles. And one of these roles that we look particularly in our study is the role of the militias in land and real estate, which is something that is a widespread phenomenon in many countries affected by organized crime and affected by armed conflict, but is not as well understood as, for instance, drug trafficking and other more classic roles of these criminal organizations. So the militias basically, through the power and the control they have over these communities, they acquire, they grab land illegally, usually areas that are of environmental protection, sometimes historical protection, and they start building things, building residential buildings or other types of businesses, and then they sell it again in an illicit manner to communities, many of which might not know that they are illicit or illegal, but they become involved and dependent on the militias that sold them their land. And through this control of the land, the militias are able to then establish some other businesses, some other forms of exploitation, businesses that are aligned to them, forms of control of these populations. They can establish security rackets, so providing security in exchange for money, in exchange for extortion, which is another name for it. So through this building of these illicit areas, the militias are able to strengthen the control over populations in Rio.
Nick, so both you and Antonio have talked about, how this happened, where this happened, but what does this control, this militia control in these areas actually mean for the residents and the level of violence?
Yeah, I mean, the violence is a really key part of this, and it's a really central part of how militias maintain their control and power in these regions. So we see quite explicit and quite overt forms of violence in the forms of physical violence. Actually, one of the most prevalent forms of violence is kind of very everyday forms of violence. So we see actually within militia-dominated communities a kind of wide sense of fear and an ability of residents to speak out against things that they might not like. They're silenced politically. They're unable to express their opinions about certain things. So the violence is maybe less visible than we see in other parts of the city. So we see quite visible forms of violence in drug trafficking communities with armed violence and shootouts, but actually in militia-controlled communities, we see a lot less of this. And there's actually a much higher number of disappearances, people going missing. We see bodies found in regions around militia-dominated areas. And I think it's also important to mention, the violence in militia-dominated areas is really quite heavily skewed by, gender, race, and minorities, such as LGBTQ communities, who are really affected quite disproportionately by militia violence. So, women, for example, experience quite acute forms of this violence. We have women who live in these areas, who work in quite distant areas, who are maybe scared to leave their house in the morning to go and travel to work and to come home late at night in the dark, who feel quite persecuted by the militias. So this is an important part of the puzzle as well.
That's really interesting, that comparison with, sort of less visible or less overt form of violence in these areas. Antonio, in the report that you and Nick did, you talked about the militias, how they control services like transportation, water, and electricity. Can you explain how they do this?
Yes, the control that the militias have over public services is part of what you and Nick were discussing about less overt forms of violence. It's, if you will, it's a form of economic violence. I've never come across something as ubiquitous as the services that the militias sort of control in Rio. So it started, as we discussed in the report over the history of these militias, it started with the provision of security. Militias, they tend to be formed, at least at the beginning, very heavily by former or off-duty police officers. So they came to the communities and they said, we are going to, you have no security, no real security provided by the state. We are going to offer you security against potential robbers, against drug traffickers, in exchange for money, in exchange for this the contribution or tax that you're going to pay us. But then this control evolved into a wide range of public services that place the militias almost like a state within a state. So very often they control the distribution of cooking gas, which is very important for people because there is no piped gas, often in informal or low-income communities, and the cooking gas sort of boxes or ad hoc boxes that they need are provided by the militias. Also, provision of electricity, transportation. Also, early on, the militias came to control through unlicensed buses or minibuses, minivans. And also the distribution of other things. And they recently, a very important service that they came to control is internet provision. So also going through telecommunications. I was talking to a journalist in Brazil, and she was traveling through the city as part of her sort of investigations, and she started to come across very frequently with cables on the street that were being cut. And she started to investigate, and she discovered that those cables were the internet cables from licit providers that the militias were cutting to be able to establish their own services that the residents are pretty much forced to adopt. So the residents end up often with less quality of services and very frequently paying a higher price. So it is a form of economic violence, if you will, but certainly a form of holding back the development and the prosperity of these communities that are held, hostage to the whims of the militias that control them, and often threaten and impede the licit providers or any competitors from arriving there.
If I can just add onto your point there, Antonio, I think just to add that I think militias are helping residents also in some ways to access resources and services that they might not be able to access through the formal markets. So, we see these informal markets emerging, illicit markets around television, transport, and the utilities as well. But often, some of the companies are not reaching residents in the West Zone. So I think militias play a role in helping to extend some of these services and resources to residents.
But it's not just internet centers, right? They also control cable television, as I understand it. How deep is this problem? Because it seems to suggest that, they're involved in all along the supply chain of all these services.
Yes, we have to understand that Rio and its metropolitan area is quite a large extent of land. So there are many informal communities or low-income communities where the state has traditionally had difficulties accessing. There are some services that are well provided that can enter these areas. For instance, if a public company needs to fix an electricity cable or a sewage line, it has ways of accessing that. Sometimes the criminal organizations or the militias that control them can access. But in general, these areas can be quite marginalized in terms of public service provision. So this marginalization makes it easier for illicit actors such as the militias to establish, to tamper with, let's say, the cables and the infrastructure of these areas to facilitate the provision of their own services. It's how it happens with cable television for quite a long time now. This is one of the oldest services that they started to provide, but also increasingly the internet and other telecommunications infrastructure that are quite vital for people's lives. So it's through this marginalization of urban spaces that they're able to do it, and their alliances with local municipal agencies, state agencies that facilitate or turn a blind eye to their involvement with these things and allow them to continue.
Thank you for that. I have one more question for you, Antonio, before I turn back to Nick with a few more questions. What is the difference between militias and Rio's infamous drug gangs? Are there any difference?
The difference has become more tenuous, more sort of subtle in recent years. Especially in the 2000s, when the militias started to become more violent and more visible, and famously, newspapers started to call them militias, whereas before, they might have been called criminal organizations or mafia organizations. In the 2000s, the militias were more frequently composed by the military police officers that we mentioned before. So they were more focused on the provision of security or security rackets with a discourse of community protection. So this discourse of protecting the communities against drug trafficking as a sort of illicit or at least legitimate form of service was more present, more prominent, and many communities actually publicly said that they welcome the militias. Many communities welcome this presence and visibly sort of embrace this narrative of the militias as a positive actor in the communities, until more and more of the violence and the threatening aspects of the militias started to emerge. And famously, reporters of a local newspaper called Odia, that they were doing an investigation into the militias, and they were apprehended by the militias and they were tortured. And this case helped to open everyone's eyes to the threatening, the dark side of the militias. So back to your question, today, gradually as the militias expanded into public service provision and expanded the range of illicit businesses, one of these businesses that some militias expanded has been drug trafficking. So which of course placed them very close to the business model, the core model of the what is usually called the drug trafficking gang. So long before the militias, the main actors, the main sort of violent non-state actors in Rio were the drug trafficking gangs, such as the Red Command, the Comando Vermelho, and now also the Third Pure Command, Terceiro Comando Puro. And these groups still exist. They establish territorial control, very fierce, very threatening territorial control, publicly displaying rifles, and a very violent and very visible form of securitized control. The militias are more discreet. They don't display the weapons very, very openly, also because they don't need to, because they often have alliances with police and other state agencies that, at least until recently, tended to have a more sort of lenient approach towards the militia, so they didn't need to protect their territories against the police operations as fiercely as the drug gangs. But essentially, the militias are still a specific and more differentiated type of criminal organization because of their close alliances to the state. There's also a cultural difference in that they come from backgrounds and that tend to be more humble than the militia, so they lack even the tools and the ability to circulate in the environments of power and political decision making that the militias circulate in. So the militias, they tend to have more infiltration into the state because of that.
Thanks for that explanation, Antonio. Nick, can I come back to you? One of the things that was mentioned in the report that caught my eye was the fact that militias mediate between states, residents, and markets. And that sounded quite mind-boggling to me. Yeah, can you tell us a bit more about it? Like, why is there a need for a mediator, and why do militias even play this role? I guess, Antonio's answer earlier sort of explained a little bit as to why maybe perhaps militias can do this role and why residents welcome it. But it would be great to hear from you to explain a little bit more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Antonio started to talk about this already in terms of the role of militias and where they come from. Especially, we talk about them coming from police or security backgrounds. They have this role within the state already, kind of working within the state apparatus. But I think to talk about this question, we really need to think about what I mentioned earlier about the different types of development. So we think about the role of, and how urbanization happens, maybe in quite quick ways, in informal ways with illicit markets. We see kind of very rapid expansion of different services and infrastructure across different parts of the city. And we see that, these markets and these expansions need to be managed in some ways. They need to be organized. They need to be mediated. They need to be kind of rolled out in certain ways. And when the state doesn't have the capacity to do so, or it isn't doing it effectively, then we have more informal types of mediation, or what we've called in this report. And, which I'll talk about in other literature as well. The term coercive brokerage is used to talk about the roles of these actors in terms of brokering or mediating between different markets, the demands and needs of residents, and the interests and the influence of states as well. So, I mean, these ideas are not especially new. They come from a long line of academic and research and literature on intermediaries and mediation and brokerage. But really, we're bringing it to this context to try and think about the ways that militias can play this role in the middle between all these different influences of states and residents and markets, as mediators, as kind of brokers, to try and organize the different demands of each of the different sectors and spheres. And they really sit at the middle there with their coercive and coercive skills and their use of violence to help shape and navigate these processes.
Going back to the militia's involvement in urban expansion, Nick, do you think that corruption plays a role in allowing this to happen?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It has several different ways that it manifests in the urban expansion process. So, I mean, we just have to look at the ways that state resources and budgets are allocated and diverted to certain militia areas. We see relationships between politicians and militia leaders, militia groups at both the local municipal level, but also the state level. Less so at the federal level, but we do see it happen. We see, we talked about it earlier in the podcast around the ways that title deeds and authorizations are given, and sometimes there's fraud involved in reproducing these authorizations and deeds that militias use to account for certain properties and property developments. We see, bribery kind of featuring quite heavily as well. Officials and state officials, police, security officials are bribed to turn a blind eye and not be involved, or they're invited to be part of certain deals and business engagements with the militia as well. The ways that resources are funneled into communities to garner political support for certain politicians that support the militias as well. And we also see, from the profits and revenues that are made from militias, money laundering is kind of featuring quite heavily as well. So there's quite a few different ways that corruption factors into this.
Given all that both of you have said around, the involvement of corruption, the militia's infiltration in political and power circles, what is the state and law enforcement doing to combat the problem?
Well, this is a very good question, and I think actually the quite a simple answer is not so much. Part of the problem is that the militias, as we've kind of just mentioned, are very political, and they're embedded within the political apparatus. They have allies in very high and powerful places, especially in the state of Rio. We're talking up to the kind of executive level. So when the policing is in Brazil is a state level issue. We have federal police, but they don't really do so much in this area of local kind of policing within the city. So the state level is organizing the policing, and actually, when you put a police officer, a police chief in place that is an ally of the political class, there's kind of certain decisions that have to be made about how policing is done, where resources are spent, and actually much of the resources are spent in other parts of the city. A classic example of this is during the UPP, so the pacification police. They're not funded so much anymore, but when they were funded, many of the UPP stations were in drug trafficking communities. There was only one, and that was in the Batang community, which is where Antonio mentioned there was a kidnapping of the journalist, right? So in the West Zone in general, we don't see much focus on the militias. We see some, every now and again, there's a crackdown and a bust and some activity that's covered in the media. It's on the TV programs, on the news, and it demonstrates there is some kind of awareness of this from the state level, but we don't see a kind of sustained campaign and a strategy to really root out this type of activity, because it is so embedded within the political establishment and the political class.
And I think those are really, insightful comments to end this podcast with. So thank you for joining us on this episode of The Index, and a special thank you to Antonio Sampaio and Nicholas Pope for being part of this discussion. You can read the report on the Global Initiative website. And to learn more about criminality and resilience in Brazil, head over to the Global Organized Crime Index, ocindex.net.